Support for Triloquy comes from Apple Music Classical, an app designed for the nuances of classical music. Listeners can search for the exact recording they want to hear and experience high-res lossless audio up to 192 kilohertz at 24-bit, along with thousands of recordings in spatial audio. Apple Music Classical is included with select Apple Music subscriptions and available now in the App Store. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Triloquy, Opus 203. Thank you so much for continuing to support the show and for being a loyal listener. I couldn't do this without you. Huge shout out to Apple Music Classical for their support and to each and every one of you for being here. I really appreciate it. If you want to learn more about the show of Triloquy or to contribute to the cause, go over to our website. That's TRILLOQUY.org. Greetings from Dallas. I'm recording this a little late. Sorry for the delay because I'm here in Texas managing my final set of earshot readings for the season. Shout out to the American Composers Orchestra and to all of my colleagues over there. Can't wait to spotlight and uplift four more emerging, living, breathing composers today. You can learn more about the work that I do with them at americancomposers.org. My name is Loki, the podcaster formerly known as Garrett McQueen. I'll speak a little bit more to my name change probably next week because there are a few other things that I want to speak to today. In addition to offering this week's conversation, I had the great pleasure of dialoguing with cellist Abel Selaocoe a few weeks back. So I'm excited to share that conversation with y'all. It was a really great one. I'm also going to speak to some recent orchestra data that people have been talking about. So that's coming up in the Triloquy, but since we're fresh off of Juneteenth, I wanted to make a little room for it before we got going today. So there are many things that I can say about the importance of Juneteenth. I hope you had a great Juneteenth, by the way, but I wanted to share with you today what Juneteenth can be when it comes to classical music, how we can perpetuate a status quo or how we can liberate ourselves from it. Y'all have heard me talk about decolonizing classical music a lot on this show. I think words like decolonize sort of lose their power, unfortunately, the more that they're used, because the actual spirit behind that mission is more radical than we tend to think of it being. When we talk about decolonization, we're talking about addressing the levels to which our thinking and our actions around certain subject or art forms, in this case, have been influenced by colonialism. In our case, that's Western European colonialism. On Juneteenth, you see a lot of Black people wearing African aesthetic clothing or just really Black clothing, Afro American attire, because everyone is dipping a toe into that idea of decolonization by doing so. If you know how I dress, I tried really hard to present a decolonized look just about every day. And the more that we celebrate Juneteenth and understand its actual purpose, I think the closer we can get to a more decolonized mode of thinking year round. So when it comes to arts institutions and radio stations that celebrate Juneteenth, I feel like a lot of folks, I hate to say it, are getting it wrong, or at least not getting it quite right. Let's think about the circumstances of composers like William Grant Still and Florence Price, the two heavy hitters when we're talking about Black classical music, right? Their music is absolutely brilliant. I'm going to say that first. Still's Afro-American Symphony is a staple, in my opinion. That is a seminal piece of American classical music, not just Black, but American classical music. And Florence Price's music speaks for itself, especially her piano music, and her story is quite just incredible as well. This music is a lot of things, but what it isn't, in my opinion, is an example of a decolonized way of presenting Black musical aesthetics through this classical art form, through this classical medium. Both Still and Price fully understood that their job was to fit within the more colonized frameworks of music the best that they could while infusing Blackness within it. This was just a mode of survival. It's what they had to do to exist as composers in the early 20th century. This was and is important work that they were doing because, again, it's quite important that we have these stories and this representation in the orchestral and chamber music, genres. But it's not quite the same as digging into African aesthetics and liberated ideas through music. William Grant Still did write a couple of really cool works that speak directly to Africanness from that Afro American perspective. Namely, he has a tone poem called Africa, and his ballet Saji is really brilliant, an African story portrayed there. Two really great motherland themed works. But I don't consider this the center of what Juneteenth is and how it should be celebrated through our art form. When we start approximating Western classical music to Juneteenth, just because the composer of the music is Black, it's really easy for us to forget that there's work to do toward our broader cultural liberation. We have to understand that the experiment of America is still running and it's still controlling many of us within it in various ways. I'm going to repeat myself. The music of Still and Price and all the others, Chevalier, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, you name them, all of it's incredible stuff. But I think we have to consider what the status quo of classical music is and how each of us perpetuates it by censoring dead composers, even composers who were Black. I like to think of a classical music ecosystem where today's living composers take the front seat, where today's conversations and where today's dialogues meet this thing called classical music. I envision this ecosystem where classical music can lead the charge to broader thinking and ultimately liberation for Black people. And not just that, the way that classical music can help people overcome homophobia and femophobia and those sorts of things, like Terrence Blanchard was talking about when he was on TRILLOQUY, the way that we can really challenge capitalism through classical music. But we can only do that by centering the way that today's composers and today's music creators are engaging that through music. I think Abel Selaocoe does a really great job of inspiring thought toward this reality because everything about his presentation points back to his cultural roots, which are ultimately also some of the cultural roots of American descendants of enslaved Africans. In our conversation, we talk about this. We get to talk about his process and some of his travels. We get stories from his home in South Africa and much more. So I'm just really, really stoked and excited and grateful to be able to share that dialogue with you. I know that was probably a mouthful, a lot of stammering and just sort of soapboxing on my end. It's 6 a.m. here in Dallas in this hotel. So if I'm not making sense, please forgive me. But at the end of the day, I hope that you can just really think about what the status quo of classical music is. The way we perpetuate Eurocentricity in our use of that phrase, classical music, and the way that Eurocentric orchestral and instrumental sounds are utilized by Black composers, past and present, will not liberate or elevate our existence. These are modes of survival under a capitalist colonial ecosystem, both musically and otherwise. So just think about that. Think about the status quo of classical music and how we aren't moving away from it in the way that we think about Black composers, the way that we perpetuate certain status quo, the way that we program. It's a deep conversation, but it's a conversation that I think we need to be having more and more toward this ultimate goal of decolonizing classical music and really just disrupting everything about classical music. I think it's all possible if we can just think about things in that way. So huge thanks to everyone over at the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra for helping me get this interview in the books. And thanks again to you for listening today. Here's a little music as performed by Abel Selaocoe to get us into my conversation with him. Hope y'all enjoy. Ke mosadi ya tshwarang thipa ka bohalemo Ke mosadi ya tshwarang thipa ka bohale o tletse ka maqheka a sa feleng ha a felwe yello yo oh no no ke mosadi ya sa felwe yo
Yeah, yeah. I think I'm slowly getting to grips with its people.
Mhm,
The orchestra is really friendly people, but they're from everywhere
mhm.
in the country. So often I've spent quite a lot of time downtown, which I've realized in the US actually people don't hang out downtown.
Not here in St. Paul
No,
anyway.
not in St. Paul. So I'm starting to look further afield. I'm kind of enjoying it. The weather reminds me of Manchester very much. When it
Okay,
rains, it's pretty much like the same kind of calm weather in that sense. But yeah, I'm happy here. I think I'm starting to look for what feels like a home. So I'm gonna
sure.
be coming back for quite a bit of projects here. So yeah,
And we're so excited to have you returning again and again and again.
yeah,
Your
yeah, yeah.
debut with the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra was a standout, to say the very
Oh,
least. Everyone
thank
was
you.
talking about it. People, in the audience were, talking to their friends. It really was just an incredible event. I wonder how you received that. What do you think that says about what you bring to a place like St. Paul?
Well, it's more what I came here to bring out.
Hmm.
More like I think everybody has an improvisational spirit, has a reflective spirit, has a place for prayer inside, and I think that's what the concert allowed. It's not to do necessarily with religion, but it's about to do with this universal need to have faith in the next moment.
Mm.
And so that was quite important to bring out of the audience, this feeling of we are gathered here as people rather than the artists and the audience. So we just dissolved that boundary between us, and it became, for the people in the room. I always say, had one person not been there, the music would have been totally different.
Wow.
So that's how I see it. To bring out this sense of gathering for everybody.
Was improvisation always a part of your practice?
Yeah, from childhood, growing up in South Africa in Sebokeng with my brother, we kind of discovered um, classical music and these instruments almost by mistake, through an
Hmm.
outreach program. And to us, it looked like tools. It didn't look like a genre. It looked like something
Mm.
that you could throw your spirit into. So we played all kinds of music already on it, and we came up from a very choral perspective. Everybody was always singing at home, and so just easily translating that language, we'd write down hymns. We would, learn hymns by ear and all of that kind of thing. Yeah.
I wonder if you'll say more to this idea of connecting the singing tradition to
Hmm.
playing an instrument. We're always telling, especially those of us who are classically trained, so-called classically trained,
Hmm.
sing with your instrument, really
Yeah.
bring it out. For
Yeah.
you, that just seems like a natural part of how you learn to play the cello.
Well, it's a challenge that we should all take on for the rest of our lives.
Mm,
Really, to be everything is a translation of the voice. If you think about it, even rhythm is a translation of language. When I start to speak my language, I can hear rhythm.
mm.
You could almost translate that into song if you wanted to. So we need to see life in its most natural form, starting from the voice, and then when you play your own instrument, even our classical teachers always say that if you can't play it, you need to sing it.
Mhm.
And then it goes all the way to jazz music. When you learn transcriptions or you try to be inspired by other people, you learn their solos by singing them first and
Yeah,
then you play them.
yeah.
So the voice, it seems for me to be the most natural place to start from, even if you don't call yourself a singer. Just start that way and feed your curiosities.
How did you, traverse doing music as something you loved into doing something that pays your bills, that allows you
Oh,
to travel the world? What was that transition
yeah,
like?
that transition was a crazy one. It was the realization came late. Because I was so crazy about, making music as a child until somebody says, "Do you know that this is your way out,
Mm,
of the township or your way out of poverty?" And I didn't think of it that way. I just thought this is something that I do. Um, and I think I have tried to keep that spirit for as long as I can, as much as I can. um, and I'm so grateful that I don't have to do anything else, and all I have to do is express myself,
mhm.
and I'm able to survive. Of course, there were hard times where I was doing that at full capacity and not getting the rewards of that. That
Sure.
that that happened, like every other musician. but it's important to realize what society needs. The same as a business. Think of it like
Sure.
that. What do they need? What does everybody need in order to be well? And I think then uh, gifting that to the world gifts you back a way of living. So that makes complete sense to me.
I wonder how you maintain that wellness for yourself, considering you're in and out of airports. And I can't
Yeah.
imagine what it's like to travel with an
Mm,
instrument the size of a cello. The
mm,
logistics of that, I don't even want to think about. But
yeah.
but when you get to the stage, there's so much joy, there's so much happiness. Where do you draw
Mm.
that from?
This is such a great question because different places provide you with different spirits,
Hmm.
and you have to be aware enough to be able to feed on that. So it's all about people.
Hmm.
Constantly people either take energy or give you energy.
Yeah,
So I look for those that give me energy
sure.
constantly. I'm like, who's here to feed me that I also can feed? And then also I have my people at home that I'm always in touch with. So if I've had a long day, it's so important to pick up the phone and call somebody who will always be on the other side
Yeah.
of the line to say, "Hey, I'm sitting in a hotel room. What are you thinking about? Oh, I'm thinking about this." And then your imagination goes. And also, it's important to enjoy one's company, uh, but it's also just important to just be so curious.
Hmm.
Curiosity trumps everything. So wherever you go, you should always be asking questions, and then people will kind of open their arms to you in that sense.
Wow, wow. I want to go back to your debut with the SPCO. Not only was this an event that people celebrated for what it was also used as a starting point of dialogue for many people about broadening what an orchestral experience is, what the repertoire
Mm,
is. I
mm.
wonder what you think about your musical performance playing a role in some of those broader conversations, not just art, but art that can lead to changes in administration or changes in the way
Mm.
we, approach this entire art form altogether.
Yeah, I mean, where do I start? I mean, ideas only come when we gather.
Mm,
That's literally, you know, you can be alone and you can have some amazing ideas, but for them to come to life, you have to actually be in connection and interaction with the world. So, what I find is that, maybe I'm repeating myself, but it's just the spirit of looking for everybody,
mhm,
and then things start to happen, and making people. I want classical music to be this environment where anybody can walk into, anybody can have something that they love within this place and something that they don't know about,
mhm,
you know.
yeah,
And this feeling for me is so paramount to every environment that I enter. That's what I want to affect. Um, so when we play African music next to classical music, we have to ask ourselves, is there a thread that binds these things together? And that's my job to explain that and to make that scene. And I want African people to start showing up, listening to Beethoven and listening to Tuareg music at the
mhm,
same time,
wow,
which I think is what the world is becoming, because we suddenly have so much access to everything, and suddenly our influences are not forced upon us. We have to choose our influences.
sure,
We have this freedom, especially in the West. People have the freedom to choose their influences, to say that's what I'll listen to, that's what I'll go to. So I think to have that in one space is very beautiful, and I want people to always gather, because I think that's where the power is, really, for everything from politics to art.
yeah. When you talk about weaving together the African music with the Beethoven, I think about that there are so many of us who just reject the tradition, reject the canon. We don't need to spend any more time with Beethoven. Why
Mm.
is it important for you to include the so-called canon in your approach to making music?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up with this thing for such a long time, so it was for me. It was never this, you know, oh, that's Bach, and to me as an individual, oh, that's sangoma music, traditional healing music.
Mhm,
It was always like, oh, these are sonic spaces. That's how I kind of describe these, like sonic spaces that get communicated around the world. Like so I became interested in, it sounds a bit abstract, but the feeling of vibrations.
mm,
Different musics allow you different vibrations. In classical music, you'll find the softest sounds that you can ever find in most music.
mm,
Um, in African music, you'll find the most circular, things that make you put you in an extremely meditative state. So all of these things for me are no longer labels of genre. I just, what do I need to prescribe today for myself or for my audience? Do
Mhm.
I need to prescribe, you know, a low vibration of contemplation, or do I need to bring a feeling of celebration or of moving your body? What is that, and how do I affect that into people? And that goes across genres, basically.
Yeah, because we're talking about so much more than just changing the repertoire. You get people, as you already spoke to, on their feet, get people singing, get
Hmm.
get people dancing.
Hmm.
There's so much of this tradition that teaches us that showing respect is sitting completely still and
Yeah.
quiet and waiting to the end. Why
Yeah.
why is it? I wonder if you could speak more to why it's so important to get people actually involved with the performance.
You know, um, music is a reflection of the people that are sitting watching it,
Mm,
and if music is this reflection of you and you hear it, and if you go by that definition, you should start reflecting the music,
mhm,
and I'm so happy for people to react the way they do in concerts. I love especially playing classical music for young people. It's kind of a thing that I used to think, oh, there won't be enough attention span. After a while of listening to this quiet
sure.
music, they'll start talking amongst themselves. I used to be so scared of that, and now it's a matter of courage and storytelling. you know so sometimes you create a bigger silence, and you wait for them to listen, and
Mm,
they start listening, and suddenly you're in a club underground somewhere, and there's 800 to 1,000 people extremely quiet and listening. And then you give them the reward of rhythmic music, and then
sure.
so the storytelling goes. So I really think that's the future, that classical music has to live within other genres, and in order for it to survive, really.
Are you confident in that future considering the fact that, the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra in many ways is an outlier in the way that, you come in and really engage audiences? In my experience, most orchestral experiences are not that. Are we moving in the right direction?
We are 100% moving in the right direction. Well, in my circle where I see
Sure.
myself, but I feel, people are really keen to listen anew.
Hmm,
Um, but I have to say that this movement, or this idea of classical music living within other realms, needs leaders. It needs people who will foster it, and who will actually do the research of why things connect. Not just to do it, but to actually explore why these sonic spaces have a connection to each other. And if we can live in that curiosity, then we are really in the right direction, and it will start really spreading to other places in the most natural way.
hmm.
I think the resistance is that, oh, the it's such opposites of sounds, but it actually isn't. We just need to find there are different pieces that match African pieces.
Yeah.
There are different pieces that match other genres of of music.
Yeah, and speaking of African music in Africa, it's not very often that I get to engage someone with actual connections to
Yeah.
the motherland. Seeing the images and watching your performances, and just noticing how Afro forward you are. You don't come out in a tuxedo and tails. You're very much celebrating your Africanness, and that's something that really resonates with me.
Yeah.
I wonder why that's important for you to not come out in the tuxedo, to not come out simply in all black, but
Mm,
really
mm.
celebrating, who you
Yeah.
are and where you come from.
I mean, identity is so important. Identity is a huge part, especially when I'm working, especially in the West. Playing for in concert halls and in all these places. The prominent identity is the audience's and not
Mhm.
mine.
Sure.
So this is my place to say, actually, I am introducing an identity to you that we are going to normalize within this space, by the way I speak, by the way I dress, by the way I walk, and by the way I play. So it's super important for me to show who I am and who I celebrate. And everywhere I go, I get different gifts of clothing from different people. what I wore in the last concert was actually from a talking drum player who I met in the last
Oh,
project,
wow.
Masamba Diop.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is incredible. So he was like, here's a clothing from my place, and some other people have given me different, cloths that I really admire. So I'm always interested in that kind of world of kind of representing the African diaspora at large in that sense. Yeah.
I'm unprepared. I should have had a cloth to gift you today, the
Yes.
next time.
Next time I'll be back. I'll be back.
When you talk about identity, I think about all of the work that the SPCO and many orchestras across the country have done in engaging things like DEI, really having conversations about diversity and applying those conversations.
Mhm,
From your perspective, considering, your global perspective as a performer,
mhm.
are those conversations the same in other places? Is there anything unique about the idea of identity and music as it exists here in the US and the way you've engaged?
Mm. I'm getting to grips with the US.
Hmm.
It's taking me a bit of time, I have to say.
We're an acquired taste.
Yeah. I'm getting to grips, man. It's really interesting. I think um, you over such a long time, you have a huge group of displaced people, and finding their own identity, and that's extremely strong everywhere I go.
Mm,
I hear it and I feel it, and I look for it. So I think the conversation here is how can we teach,
mm,
um, and that's my journey. So everywhere I go, I say, how can I teach and how can I learn? So, we talk a lot on our journeys with Jonathan a lot about, who lives here.
mhm,
That's always my question: who lives here? Who's around here? Who's downtown? Oh, who's in the suburbs?
mhm,
Where because when I think about South Africa, even its own layout, in the apartheid days, we had this, in the middle, the central business district, and the outer layer was the suburbs, and
mm,
then in between, absolutely nothing, and then on the outer layer was the townships, where it was actually planned that there would be no access to being able to live, and be a part of the economy and be a part of the fast moving world, and we'd be like in our own world.
mhm,
And those places still exist. It's still built like that, and we're trying to create, a kind of life in the township where there's buzzing opportunity, there's progress, there's new discoveries, and everybody's really trying to eradicate this thing, but it takes a long time.
mm.
So, I ask about those kind of things: who lives here? I think that's quite important for me, and I can see that people are very awake about that, and especially the orchestra are quite keen to open up and talk about these things. And it's a very conversational orchestra, which is extremely unusual. Everybody talks, and I think the more we get to know each other, the more we'll speak about the type of things we're talking about today.
So say more about why that's important. There are many people who would never think about a conversation happening within a rehearsal among
Mm,
all the musicians. We're just taught
mm,
about this tiered thing where the conductor is
mm.
at the front and calls all the shots, and
Yeah.
that's it.
Yeah, hierarchy seems to have been an extremely important thing in classical music, and that's actually starting to dissolve quite a bit.
Mm,
And also my system is that yes, there's a leader, but yes, there's a community, and when the community speaks, you listen,
mm,
right? And if the people are not happy, then you have nobody to lead, So that's quite important in that sense, that we open this dialogue, and it's unusual because luckily the music requires this.
sure.
The music that we play requires this. So one of the processes that we went through, I'll tell you now. I wrote a piece like the night before, the Tanzanian Blue,
Mm,
right? And had decided from a long way away that I will bring this piece, and they'll see it when they see it, and they will learn it by ear, right? And that never happens in orchestras.
mhm,
And that opened a huge dialogue between ourselves about expression, about listening, about when it's whose turn, and the type of attentiveness that was there was incredible, and I had never seen it anywhere else in orchestras. And people were almost coming up with their own material in some places, and there was this license of freedom and voice, and that's very unusual. And so I'm looking to do that with many orchestras, to give this, and this is the gift that I have with the incredible SPCO. They're making incredible music by listening and by being responsive. Yeah.
what would you say to people who would say to you, well, it's one thing to create that sort of environment with the SPCO. It's a smaller group, it's very intimate. You can't possibly do that with a 100-piece symphony orchestra. What do you say to those folks?
Oh man, I say Africa. Yeah, I say communities. Like, look at how other people gather, and I think that's one thing to learn. Actually, I ask myself about that often. Look, how do people gather in different places? What is the decorum?
Mm,
Who speaks first? Does the last person get to speak or not? And I think there are places where people are allowed full expression within hundreds of people. And I think that's incredible without losing control,
mhm.
which I think is incredible. Um, I definitely think it's possible within an orchestra, but most of all, we do need leaders,
Mm.
leaders that think in this way, leaders that are so aware of the people around them, leaders that are sensitive to styles, leaders that are ready to listen to the people that are speaking at them. So that's super important.
So for all of the leaders listening right now,
Mhm.
what would you say should be their step one right now toward moving their organization, their musical community in a more inclusive direction?
Yeah, so we have see the light in other people.
Hmm.
So that's so important. See the potential in everybody around you, and then everybody's strengths, and then on top of that, make amazing relationships with different people. I know that uh, for instance, in an orchestral rehearsal, when everybody's got their heads down and they're kind of resistant, I know definitely within this group, there's one person I can look at and say, "Can I trust you to affect change wherever you are?"
Hmm.
And that's leadership. That relationship is very strong, and I look at that person, I say, "Affect change wherever you are." I look at another person, and before you know it, everybody's is back. So I think that's very important for leaders to be able to do.
How can people learn more about you, support your work, and keep up with all of your here's and theirs?
Yeah, I'm all over the internet. I'm always traveling. On my website, all my dates of where I am in the world are always up on abelselaocoe.com. And I'm on Instagram. Again, my name, Abel Selaocoe. And also, I have an album out, which is a kind of offering that's asking about the question of home. The album is called Where is Home? And it goes through the different styles of South African music, but also classical music. I play a little of Baroque in there and quite a lot of improvisation and extremely exciting rhythmic music. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Speaking of home, answering that question, where is home?
Mm.
When I think about expanding the canon, I think about how we need to learn what is so-called canon in other parts of the world. I wonder if you could if you could pinpoint one thing, what's an important or really significant song from your home or melody from your home that
Oh,
we need to consider if we want to think about expanding the canon and, highlighting culture that's different from ours, but important in other places.
yeah. Um, a melody,
Sure.
a melody that's important at home. At this moment in time, in this current state, we have a song in South Africa that says, "What did we do? Senzeni Na." It goes, Senzeni Na, Senzeni Na, Senzeni Na, Senzeni Na, Senzeni Na, Senzeni Na. And it's about a lot of people singing together, asking this question of healing. What have we done? And I think that we need to ask this question. We need to have a reflective society. So often, like, we have these things that activate these kind of thoughts to ask these questions. So, Senzeni Na, what did we do and what should we do?
Senzeni Na.
Senzeni Na, as performed by the Cape Town Youth Choir, featuring Monday Mdingi there, getting us into the conversation. We heard Abel Selaocoe featured with the Manchester Collective in a tune called Siroko Kabohaleng. So, really grateful again to have that dialogue. I hope that you got something out of that, and I hope that it helped you think about this idea of a decolonized musical ecosystem a little more, sounds and aesthetics and practices that aren't rooted in what we were taught as classical music, but are rooted in what an expanded view of classical music is. Huge shout out and thanks once again to Abel Selaocoe for that incredible dialogue. I know it was a shorter one, but one that I was very glad to present. All right, well, we are here toward the end, and there's one subject that I wanted to make sure that I brought to the front. I'm reading from the New York Times here. The headline is The United States orchestras gradually diversify, but are slow to hire Black musicians. It says here the number of Asian and Latino players has risen over the past decade, according to a new report, but Black musicians are still scarce, especially at large orchestras. I think there's a lot to unpack here. I hope that you will go find that New York Times article and take a look. But my immediate takeaways root back sort of to what I was talking about with Juneteenth and decolonized thinking. So let's think about the history of the United States. We have people who came here and executed a genocide against millions of indigenous communities. And I think it's important even there to remember the fact that this wasn't just one people or one people group that were completely eradicated. These were nations of different people, different cultures, different music that were completely wiped away so that Africans could be brought in as slaves to do the work of codifying and building the financial foundation of the United States that made so many things possible, including immigration from other parts of the world, the integration of other cultures and other experiences into these so-called United States. So why do I mention that? I mention that because when it comes to indigenous people and to American descendants of enslaved Africans, there is a very, very unique set of circumstances that are there that I don't think are often thought about or really foregrounded when we talk about diversifying classical music or even decolonizing classical music. Black and indigenous people have a very specific set of circumstances here in the United States. So to me, it's no surprise that other people groups from other parts of the world are able to come to the United States and to do things like enter orchestras to a large degree or have a lot of representation in orchestras. I mean, think about folks from China and Japan here in the United States and their relationship with orchestral music. They are well represented in the field, and as this report from the New York Times says, to a degree, so are people from the Latine diaspora. Well, that isn't quite the case for Black people because so many of us are not yet 6 or 7 generations away from the plantation. I recently lost my grandmother. I think I've talked about it here on Triloquy, but she was born a sharecropper, which, and we can split hairs, but in essence, she was born into a certain type of slavery. And I knew her, you know, all my life. She passed away about 6 weeks ago. So under those circumstances, what could she have passed on to my parents, and what could my parents have passed on to me to help me become the concert master of insert orchestra? And not that that's something that I aspire to, because I think we also have to challenge the white supremacy of our aspirations and why we have certain goals and certain things that we want to do with our lives. But anyway, long story short, the fact that orchestras are becoming more and more diverse and Black people are being left behind is yet another symptom of America's just foundational sin, of America's foundational problem, the genocide against indigenous people and the erasure of culture and a way forward for Black folks. Now, that is not to say that any of us are some sort of victim or anything. There are a lot of Black people. There are a lot of American descendants of enslaved Africans who have done very well for themselves, certainly in music, both classical and otherwise. But that does not account for the whole. That does not account for the broader sense of this conversation and an opportunity for all folks, all Black people, to really pick themselves up and to have a shot at this so-called American dream. So, as we move forward, I'm keeping it short this week because I'm late and I got to get to these readings. But as we move forward, I hope that we'll continue not only to think about the specificity of blackness in this conversation of so-called classical music, but the ways in which the uniqueness of blackness is marginalized through this BIPOC lens. I love all of my BIPOC people, all people of color and white folks. We need to stand together to change this world. But viewing issues in classical music strictly through a BIPOC lens marginalizes so many people, namely indigenous and black people. So I hope that this report from the New York Times helps people think about that a little bit more, shed light on the larger issue of race in the United States, what it means to be BIPOC versus what it means to not be black. That is something that we need to talk about more, something that's always at play. There are many critical race theorists who talk about when immigrants come to the United States, they fully understand the pecking order. They understand what is at the top and who is at the top and who isn't, and what they need to aspire to aesthetically when it comes to their aspirations, when it comes to the way that they dress, even think about the idea of professionalism. All of those things point to anti-blackness, and the sooner that we can really understand and apply that to classical music, I believe the sooner that we have a shot in actually creating a decolonized, even liberated ecosystem. Thanks again so much for listening. Thank you for your continued support through the transition of this show here into season 5. And I will talk to y'all again next week. Cheers.